Okay, well, I'll just kind of get started with the intro stuff. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm Sarah Isaac. I am a grant specialist at DECHR, Division of Energy, Housing, Community Resources, and I oversee the EHH and ESG grants. So recently I did a monitoring of House of Hope as the lead agency for the Brown County Coalition of EHH funding. And as part of that monitoring, I reviewed client files. And when I reviewed it, I just noticed several insufficiencies and things that were missing. So I just wanted to have this training just to get everyone in one place, to go over all the requirements, to make sure everyone understands what's required and is on the same page. So the PowerPoint I'm going through is quite wordy. So I'm not going to read it word for word, but I will send it to you guys after the training today. So you have it as a reference. It goes through specifically every checklist item and every requirement for each project type. Feel free to ask questions at any time. I'll try to stop, probably every couple slides to see if there's questions, or feel free to put it in the chat. Please ask any question if you are at all unclear on what a requirement is, or if something would be sufficient to meet it or not. And I am joined today by Emily Bourne, who's also a DECHR staff member, who's been helping me with these programs. So if you see her there.
Hello, guys. Nice to be here.
All right, so let's go ahead and go. Okay, so I realized that EHH has a lot of requirements, and they are all required by statute. So they're not something I can reduce, but I've tried to make it easy for people to know what their requirements are by creating these client file checklists that list all the requirements. There is one for each project type. Every checklist starts the same with this, the box with the client name, the program, the entry and exit dates. It is very important that the entry and exit dates are clearly indicated in the file. So you don't have to use these client file checklists, but I do encourage it because it's a way to make sure that the file contains what it needs to. They are Word documents, so you are welcome to edit them. And if you don't use these, making sure whatever you do use includes the elements that are on these checklists. Yeah, so the entry and exit date, it's important to note because that does influence when I'm looking at a file for monitoring. The entry date tells me, when that verification of homelessness needs to be. The exit date tells me, if recertification is needed. So it's important that they're clearly noted in the file and that they're also consistent throughout the file. Okay, so these are just some screenshots of what these checklists look like. Hopefully you've seen them before. So for outreach and shelter, there's just 6 items that are needed for each file. For rapid and prevention, a little bit more, about 20, because there's that financial assistance involved. And I'll be going through each of these in detail in what each of these items are. So the first checklist items I'm going to go over are applicable to every project type. So whether you're rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, or street outreach or prevention, all of these items are included. So the first one is an intake form or an initial assessment. So this is something that's not just demographic data. You need an assessment of some kind that determines eligibility. This can be done in many different ways, but just some type of, it doesn't have to be complicated, just something that shows what the client's needs are and that they're eligible for service. And it needs to be dated close to program entry. So I don't say it has to be exactly like the date they entered. If it's maybe a week or so on either end, that's fine. However, sometimes I will get a file that's maybe dated like a month before they actually entered a program, and that's getting a little bit too far away. So you do need to be close to when they entered the program. So then also on each of these slides, I'm going to show you what the actual statute is that shows where this requirement is coming from. So 24 CFR, so this is the Code of Federal Regulations, and 576 is what governs ESG. So this is just, so if you're questioning, what exactly the checklist item means, you can reference this actual statute of where that's coming from. Okay, next is documentation that the client meets an eligible definition of homelessness at program entry. So for street outreach and emergency shelter programs, self-certification is fine. However, when you're looking at rapid rehousing or prevention, we are going to look for that source documentation or third party. If you cannot obtain that source documentation, then you need to have some type of certification from your agency that you tried to obtain it but were unable to. So if you're using that balance of state verification of homelessness form, there's that little section there that asks about, what you did to try to get it, and that's there for a reason, and it's because of documentation needs to be for the night program prior to program entry. So this is, I think, the most common error I've come across with this form. So the homelessness is not, a month before they enter the program, and it's not after they entered. So sometimes I'll get that documentation and it says, the client's in shelter for that shelter program. But what I need to say is, where were they before they entered the shelter? Because that's what makes them eligible for shelter. And for DV agencies, that's where you need to show that category for fleeing domestic violence. So there needs to be a statement somewhere that when they're entering the program, they were fleeing DV. It can just be like a sentence that they initial, but it needs to be clearly documented that when the person entered your program, they met an eligible definition of homelessness. I know sometimes with shelters, maybe you don't get to that, the paperwork, maybe, right away, maybe that initial day, maybe it's a few days later, and that's okay. But the documentation just needs to say, so if they entered the shelter on April 1st, and maybe you're doing the paperwork, April 2nd, then it just needs to say, when they entered the shelter on April 1st, this is where they were the night before. And then here are the eligible definitions by component for street outreach. The person has to be category 1 and they have to be unsheltered. So on the streets or other places not meant for human habitation, and be unwilling or unable to access services in the shelter. For emergency shelter, it's any of the 4 categories of homelessness. For prevention, it's categories 2, 3, or 4 of homeless, or the at-risk of homelessness definition. And then for rapid, they have to be the category 1 homeless. Are there any questions on this one? So the next item is a termination procedure, and then anything related to a termination if it happens. So this is talking about involuntary terminations. There's a couple ways to document it. The most common are you can have a signed copy of the procedure itself. Often the procedure could be included in other documents like a program agreement or some type of intake form. But you can also have a signed acknowledgement of receipt of the procedure. So something that the person signs that says, I, the client, certify that I received a copy of this procedure. Either one of those would meet this requirement. And there's the statute.
Sarah.
Yes.
This is Bev. We have, behaviors that could lead to, being exited from that night on safe parking. And then we have a return to, which would include just that they've talked with someone and they figured out a plan on how they're not going to repeat those behaviors on the lot.
Okay.
So it's a return procedure, not a termination procedure. And then in our initial handbook or initial agreement, there is listed, right, the behaviors that could lead to someone being exited for the night. But it's like when they come to safe parking, it's, it's every day is a new day. So there's not like an intake for this amount of time. You come every day. If you show up, and we're there for you. And if you don't, you can show up when you do show up again or never. So
sure.
I'm not here.
So there needs to be some type of termination procedure for, so let me go on this next slide and then I'll answer more of your question. So this is
Okay.
just getting to a little bit more about the specifics of what the procedure needs to be. So termination from any program requires a formal process that recognizes, individual rights. Only in the most severe cases should termination occur. So for an emergency shelter or street outreach program, this top bullet is the only thing that the statute says. So basically you need a process, not just a list of reasons that they could be asked to leave. So, maybe you have something that says, if you do X, Y, or Z, you'll be asked to leave the program. But there also needs to be a process involved, like, how will the person be notified? How much time will they have to leave? Something like that. For termination from a rapid or prevention program, the statute's a little bit more specific. So the formal process has to include a written notice to participant containing the reason for termination, and then the option for the person to ask for a review of the decision. So basically a grievance procedure, and then written notice of the final decision. So you can't just have reasons for termination, you need to have an actual procedure. So in this case of like an outreach program, there needs to be something that says, so if you have, a list of behaviors that could cause the person to be asked to leave that day, that's good. But then you also like, well, how will they be asked to leave? Will they be told orally? Will they be, given a written notice? It doesn't have to be a complicated process, but it just has to be something that's written down as your procedure. So like, here's a couple examples. So here's one for emergency shelter, where they just kind of use the language straight from the statute. You'll be given a copy of, the expectations and the termination process at entry. In this case, they're giving them a written notice and then, asked to leave. For rapid and prevention, again, this one is just kind of using the statute language. But so Bev, does that make sense of what you're going to need for your outreach program, or do you have, I'm not sure what your question was.
Yeah, so because it's really if the safe shelter staff are not able to de-escalate and resolve on the site, if the police need to be called and they're not able to de-escalate and they're removed by the police, that's really, it's happened maybe twice. It's right.
So is that the only situation in which someone would be terminated from the program? Okay, so then you could just write that, that you could, that's your process, like, so if, a behavior, an unacceptable behavior happens, agency will do this, police will be called and will do this. And then if, and then removed by police if necessary, then that's the program termination. So it's basically just writing that down. And then making sure that the client's aware of it, so when they enter the program, like, so that if they do this behavior, this is what will happen.
Okay.
I have a question that goes along with that. Then,
Yeah.
Let's say they leave angrily and they refuse to answer that question, or refuse to sign a statement that's saying that they, were asked to leave or whatever.
No, this is in the intake, your intake agreement.
Intake.
This procedure will be in there that they sign.
Okay.
So we just need to add those phrases to it.
Okay.
Yeah, and it could just be, be a paragraph. It doesn't have to be, super detailed, but just what the process is going to be. And then, so if someone then is asked to leave and that happens, you just document that in like a case note or something in the file that like, this is what happened. Yeah. Any other questions on the termination procedure? So next is the certification of the client's program entry into HMIS or a comparable database. A couple of ways to do that. The easiest way is if you're using HMIS, just a printout of that entry exit record. The one thing to note is we're not talking about just like the client's demographic data entered into HMIS. We're talking about entry into the program. So we want to see that, the screen that shows the date that they entered the program and exited if they had. You could also, though, have a statement of data entry initialed by a staff member. So if you have, something that says, data entered into HMIS or entered into Osnium, and then the staff like initials and dates it, that would also qualify for this. That entry date in HMIS, it should match the entry date throughout the file. So this is where that consistency comes into play. So if you're using that checklist, making sure that entry date matches your HMIS record, and that matches, your eligibility documentation and whatnot. And then for rapid rehousing, just keeping in mind that the entry date is not the same as the move-in date. So the entry date is when the person is shown to be eligible for the program and they enter it, and it'd be very rare that that would be the same day that they move into it. Any questions on that one?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I work with the safe parking program, and we have a lot of people that come 3 days and then they're not there for 4 days, and then they come 2 days and then they're not there for 2 days, and then they come for 3 days. It's a lot of that. Our policy is if they're gone more than 30 days, then they have to do another intake.
Sure.
I guess I just want to be sure that that fits within these guidelines.
Yeah, so that would be so agencies have discretion to be able to set that. So basically, they enter the program, they're in and out, and then if they're gone for, so I don't know, is it if they're gone for more than 30 days, is that when you exit them?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So then, then you just exit them, and then if they come again, then you would just re-enter them and you'd have to do, the intake paperwork again. That's totally fine.
A question still back on the other one on termination.
Yeah.
In brackets on the form, it says not required for single day services. And I guess I kind of assumed we were in that category. Can you tell me what is a single day service?
Yeah, so that's coming. So was that is that the outreach that says that?
In the street outreach. Yeah.
The street outreach checklist. Yeah,
checklist.
so there are some street outreach projects that they only see the person once, so that they're on the streets, they find somebody, they, get them connected to services, or they do some type of engagement and then they never see the person again. So something like that is not required. But if you're and then in the HMIS, so it's a single day. So the entry and exit are the same day. But for the safe parking program, it's not a single day. They're entering, but then they're in and out. So, but they're in the program for more than one day.
Okay.
And that's why that termination would be required. Yeah. Other questions? So next is the demonstration of referral and connection to homeless and mainstream services. So this is showing that there has to be documentation that those referrals were made while the client was in the program. And here's the statute. So it's not enough just to show what the referrals the client already had when they entered, but what were they connected to while they were in your program. So the most common way this requirement is met is with a checklist of some kind, where you're having, a list of what the resources, common resources, and then you're indicating, do they already receive it? If they don't, are they eligible for it? And yes, when was that connection made? And this isn't saying that it needs to be a formal referral that you follow up on. It could just be, you referred them to, this agency, or you provided them with the information on it. And that's what it's asking about. There are some cases where maybe the client already receives everything they're eligible for, in which case you could put that on the form. But also keeping in mind, this isn't just the official mainstream sources. This is also community resources. So, did you refer them to a food pantry, or to maybe another agency program, or, energy assistance, or just anything that you could have provided the client with information on. This is what should be indicated. This shows common errors. So the first one is, they have the form, they fill it out, but it's only showing what they already have and it doesn't document any referrals that were actually made. And then this one here, where the only referral they know is the agency that receives the EHH assistance. So again, that's not enough if it's just referring, to your own EHH program. If you are referring to other programs in your agency, that could count, so maybe they come in for shelter, but there are some other programs in your agency you provide and you refer them to those, like you could also document that and that would meet that requirement.
So we
Is-
document,
Yes.
oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, any questions?
We document in our Osnium database,
Mhm.
each time that they've had contact and made a referral. So we have like a referrals tab that shows the
Yes.
dates and who did the referrals and to what agency.
So that would be perfect. Yep, you would
So I
just print
can-
that out though.
Screenshot that
Yes.
and print that for the report. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you.
And when I'm talking about, the things needed in the file, it's needed when when the file is monitored. So like you can keep these things electronic or in your system, but the main thing, because I don't have access to, to HMIS or Osnium, that if the file is reviewed, that you're making sure you're printing out those parts to be able to provide them. Yeah, Osnium has a really nice setup for documenting referrals. So yeah, that would be great.
Sarah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So we have a paper document like this that our advocates have in their file, and then obviously we do the electronic in Osnium as well.
Mhm.
And ours, I mean, they don't look like, they're not these exact ones, but they look pretty
Right.
similar. With our boxes that we check off yes or no and what date we made the referral and then updated notes.
Mhm.
If we haven't heard anything back from you about those, are we good to go to keep doing what we're doing, or should we do something different even if we haven't heard back from you regarding this document?
So anything that was insufficient or missing, I would have noted on my my monitoring results. So, and I do have it up here for Golden House. So it looks like 2 of the files were missing that documentation of the referral services. So either the form maybe was just missing from that file, but it looks like one of the files isn't noted here. So that must have had one that was fine.
Okay, yeah, and I did get those two. I think when they went through the scanner, they must have stuck together. So I actually got them over to Shannon right away.
Sure, yeah, and that's the thing, like I so much prefer on-site monitoring, because that's so common, like that it's like a scanning error, or maybe something like was two-sided and wasn't scanned. So I fully understand, like some of this stuff, like is most likely you do have it, it just wasn't, in the file that I was sent. So then, I had to note it, but yeah, so if you have a form, yeah, these are just examples, but what you're describing is exactly what we're looking for.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Mhm. Other questions so far? All right. All right, so one of the other items is a record of services provided. So this one's kind of vague in the statute. So I tried to make it easy by putting it just right on the checklist. So when we're talking about services, we're not talking about like super detailed. This is just kind of like in general, what was provided. So like in the statute, so you basically just have to say, so, okay, I'll back up. On the checklist, on every checklist, it lists what services are eligible for that project type. So for example, so this looks like, must be like from a snapshot from like Rapid. So like, did you provide case management, childcare services, education services? And then you can just check it. And then that's going to be all you need to do. Or just something similar to this. I can often, if a checklist isn't used, I can usually get this if you, maybe had case notes or have some other type of documentation, but just something basically that shows, what did you provide the client? And then if there's any type of financial assistance provided, making sure you're including the amount and type of each of those. And there's a few ways to do this one. So you could have like an expense summary, maybe like, if you have like a fiscal ledger of some kind that lists what they all are, copies of purchase orders, if you put them in HMIS, the service transactions, things like that. And I have a couple examples on the next slide. So these are some good examples of tracking the payments made. So it's showing exactly, what was the type of assistance and what was the amount, and the date that it was provided. So this one's kind of more laid out. This one's more open, where you have, the payment amount, if there is a utility, and the total amount. So this is the type of thing that is very clear of what service you provided the client and what financial payments were made on behalf of that client. Okay, so those are all the items for outreach and shelter programs. Are there any questions on that have come up for what we've gone over so far? Okay, so yeah, so when I'm looking at like the results letter from the monitoring files, it looks like the common ones were, that documentation of referrals, the termination procedure, certification of entry into HMIS, things like that. And like I said, like most likely, especially like that missing certification of entry into HMIS. I mean, I highly doubt that they weren't entered, but it wasn't documented in the file. So that's where that documentation is so important.
So there's a place in also in Osmium. So it's just screenshotting that spot that shows that we inputted them.
Yeah, that would be great. So the main thing is it's showing like an entry date. Yeah, but screenshots, totally fine. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some items, the additional items that are also going to be required for rapid rehousing and prevention programs. So first here is the recertification. So the evidence of continued eligibility, which includes that reevaluation of income and other resources and support networks. So for rapid rehousing, it's required every 12 months. For prevention, it's every 3 months. And then for ESG-CV prevention, it's every 6 months. And the thing to note here is the time starts at program entry, not just when rental assistance begins. So if they're entering, say, a rapid program, but they don't, end up housed until 3 months later, the recertification is when they entered the program, not just when they started, when they moved into a unit. And so for that recertification, you need to show that the income doesn't exceed that 30% of CMI and that they continue to lack resources to retain housing without assistance. And then for ESG-CV, it's 50%, not 30. But for the others, it's 30. And that's why it's important that it clearly shows if the client is exited or not. That's again where the entry and exit dates are important. So we also need evidence of the case management meetings monthly. This can be done in a few ways. Case notes, it could be like some type of service log or HMIS service transactions. So the thing here is like, you don't have to include case notes because what I really need to see is just like the dates that it happened. So if you don't want to provide, like your full, if you have pages and pages of case notes, honestly, sometimes it's a lot easier if you just have like a single like summary page of like, these are the dates they met with the client. But then also this is, I want to add, it's attempts for case management, at least monthly. So if, you try to, you're documenting your attempts to contact the client. So maybe, they don't get back to you, but at least you're documenting that, you called them, you emailed them, and were unable to meet, but your attempt to do it would satisfy this requirement. If you're only paying rental arrears, so like in rapid or prevention, you need to document at least one meeting. But otherwise, if the program is more than a month, there should be a meeting at least once a month. And it can be in person, it could be a phone call, it could be an email, some type of connection. And then the housing stability plan. So this is just a plan to retain that housing after the assistance ends. So it's not always called the housing stability plan. Sometimes it's called like a goal plan or a service plan or just something like that the client is setting some goals of what do they need to do to maintain that housing. And there's that statute. Any question on the first few items?
And I would just say, no question is a dumb question, as I've been learning this, and I'm fairly new to DECHR. I have peppered Sarah with questions, and she's been very gracious to answer all of them. So yeah, I would just encourage you guys to ask any questions if you have them.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, absolutely. Like that's what this training is for. It's for you guys to make sure, you know, it's clear on what these things mean. You know, when you're reading, especially when you're reading the statute, you know, I can't say that it's always very clear what that means. So, all right. So next is, so this one is only applicable to prevention. So that's that income determination form at program entry. So this is something that used to be required for RAPID, but it's not required by statute for RAPID. For rapid rehousing, the only time the income comes into play is at recertification, not at program entry. So we have since removed that, just in, you know, the spirit of flexibility. So for a prevention program though, so when they're entering the program, you need that income form showing the client earns less than that 30% CMI, and along with the source documentation. And if you can't get that source documentation, then you again need that certification that you tried to obtain it, and get that self-certification from the client. So you need to have like an actual form that calculates annual income and indicates compliant with the CMI threshold. So often I'll see forms where it's just showing like a monthly income, and that's not going to be sufficient. So even though, I mean, if the person's monthly income, you know, is like $1,000, like, yes, they're going to qualify, but you do need that form that shows, you know, here's what the annual income is, and it's, you know, it complies with that CMI percentage. There is, depending on the funding source, that CMI is a little different. So for HPP, if you're not using it as match, the income limit is 60% CMI. And for ESG-CV, the COVID money, it's 50%. You know, just to make them extra confusing with lots of different numbers. But so ESG, it's 30%, and any funds used as match to ESG is 30%. If your HPP not as match, it's 60, ESG-CV, 50. Any questions on that one?
Turn left on I-41 South.
All right, next is a copy of the lease agreement. Few things there. The lease dates need to cover the dates of rental assistance provided. So this usually comes into play in prevention programs where maybe the rent arrears are from like from months in the past, and they provide a lease that's like new. So you're just making sure that the lease in the file covers the dates of rental assistance that you're giving, you know, that you're paying. So if the rental arrears is from 6 months ago, you need the lease from 6 months ago.
Sarah?
To make sure, oh, yes.
Okay, is there any other way that we can document payments if it's not included in the lease? Like if we do the landlord incentive, if that wasn't documented in the lease, would like a letter from the landlord stating that they got that funding, or would like a, like how do we need to record that if it's not in the lease?
So that would be the rental assistance agreement, which is coming up. So the lease is the agreement between the tenant and the landlord, and making sure that it shows the term, that it shows the rent amount, the security deposit amount, you know, what utilities are covered. Those are all things in the lease. But the agreement between the landlord and the agency is the rental assistance agreement. And that's what's going to list out like a landlord incentive that was paid. And we'll get to that one in a bit.
Okay, thank you.
So the other thing about the lease, make sure it's signed by both the participant and the landlord. I'm always surprised by the number of leases I get that are not signed. I assume how that happens, you know, you ask the client for the lease, they give it to you, maybe they give you an unsigned version. But just when you get that, making sure you're looking at it and that it is signed. and that also like the term and the rent are all on it, because I have seen some where like, you know, there's like a spot in the lease to list the term, but it's blank, you know, so things like that, making sure that the lease is, you know, fully listing out the things you need to see. And making sure that rent and the security deposit amounts in the lease are consistent with the payments made. So where this comes into play as an error is often, you know, maybe the agency is paying a double security deposit, but it doesn't say it in the lease. So if the lease says the deposit is 1 month's rent, you know, say $500, then that's the only security deposit the agency can pay. You can only pay as a double security deposit if it's stated as that in the lease. So here's an example of an error where, so we have the lease where it says like the security deposit, and it just says to be paid by Salvation Army, so the agency, but it doesn't list an amount. So that's actually not sufficient. So because the amount is not listed in the lease, then that security deposit is not eligible to be paid with funds. So in a situation like this, where the lease doesn't say an amount, but a payment was actually made, so those funds would need to be returned. So the lease has to say what the amount is. Any questions on that? Right. So next up are some VAWA things. So the first is VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, and there is a lease addendum that needs to be signed with every lease. It's a specific HUD form, 91067, and this is a form that's for the landlord. So the landlord signs it, they're certifying that yes, you know, they are aware of VAWA and that it applies to any recipient of federal funds. So then the other VAWA forms are for the tenant. So these are the notification of the protections. Again, they are specific HUD forms, so 5380 and 5382, and they need to be provided to everyone who's receiving EHH assistance at specific times. And the simplest way to document this in the client file is to have a form that's basically having them acknowledge receipt of the documents, because there are various times. So basically what it comes down to is when they start receiving assistance and if they're ever terminated. So what, you know, so at intake, when they start receiving EHH assistance, they receive a copy of these forms. And then if they are, you know, involuntarily terminated, or if they receive an eviction notice from the landlord, they're provided them again. So, you know, so this doesn't have to be a physical form. I mean, you could email it to them, you know, give them a form, something. And then because the forms can be, you know, they are several pages. So if you want to, instead of just having like the entire form that's signed saying they got it, just something that says like, you know, I, the client, confirm that I received this form. So a little bit, so these are just examples of the forms. So the first form, the 5380, is the notice of occupancy rights under VAWA. So this is a HUD form that you can edit, and you can put in the housing provider, which is you, the grantee, and then for the name of the program. So you could put ESG, I mean, you could put, you know, rapid rehousing or whatever, if you're, you know, whatever program name you have. And then the other form, the 5382, is the form that the person would actually fill out if they were going to like make use of their rights under VAWA. So the main thing is just they have to be provided these two things. So these are some good examples. So here's just an acknowledgement of protections where, you know, by signing it, I acknowledge I've received a copy. The client signs and dates. This is one where they have like at the various times they've received it. So when they applied for assistance, when they're enrolled in the program, and then if they were terminated. So it's one form, but the client can sign it, you know, at each of these times. And you don't have to do it, what is it? Yeah, so it's when, if they are denied assistance, receiving it. So basically, you know, when they start assistance and when, if they're evicted or terminated. Any questions on VAWA?
I have a question for VAWA and lead-based paint. I have an addendum that I always add in, but sometimes landlords will already have one or the other or both. should I still keep adding my own stuff in, or can I, like, is theirs good enough?
So for the VAWA stuff, so if it's like, if it's extremely similar, you can, I know a lot of leases have like a snippet about like the domestic violence stuff, but I think for the VAWA lease addendum, that is a nice thing to have in addition. But for the lead-based paint, if the landlord already has one and it's filled out completely, you would not have to do that again.
Thank you.
All right, so then the next one is documentation of payments made to landlords. This is a very common element that is missed in files. So this is like the actual, so we already talked about where you needed to like list the payments that were made, but these are documentations that like of the actual payment. So this is, we're talking about like a fiscal ledger or copies of the actual checks. So just having like a purchase order or a check request is not sufficient by itself. So you need the documentation of the actual payment. And these should include the dates of occupancy, which is basically just saying like what the check is for. So it doesn't just say rent, it says like April rent, or, you know, it says, you know, security deposit or late, or whatever, you know, in the ledger or the check, it says what that payment was for. And I know that often, you know, the payment documentation is not kept in like a client file, and it's more like in a fiscal file. You know, and I get that, but you know, when the file is monitored, you do want to make sure it's included. I think maybe one of the easiest things, especially like when the file is closed, just to like print out like a copy from fiscal, if you can just show like every payment that was made, you know, on behalf of that client and just stick it in the file. And then that would meet this requirement. Okay, so then here's the rental assistance agreement. So this is the agreement between you, the granting agency, and the landlord. And this is going to outline the terms under which that assistance is going to be provided. So this is where you're going to note like everything you're paying. So if you're paying a security deposit and, you know, rent and a landlord incentive, this is where that's documented. Because this is where the landlord is agreeing that they will accept these payments, you know, for this client to be in the unit. And there's a couple of requirements that the statute has. The statute's quite wordy, but basically, so it has to say that if the owner provides any eviction notice or 5-day notice or anything to the client, that they provide you, the agency, with a copy. And then it also needs to include VAWA protections. So this is very vague to me, because it talks about having, like it must include the protections applied to VAWA, but like they're already signing the lease addendum, you know, so like, it seems kind of strange to me. However, it is in statute. So what I kind of tell people is, so maybe just having like a sentence in that rental assistance agreement that like, you know, acknowledging that VAWA protections apply, or like referring, you know, to the lease addendum or something like that. And that would be fine. So here's an example of an error that's fairly common, where, so on this rental assistance agreement, it says that the agency will pay a security deposit in first month's rent in the amount of $500. So this is, I guess it's deceptive, because technically what they mean is that if the security deposit is $500 and each month of rent is, you know, $500, but that's not what this says. And so what was actually paid, so the security deposit was $500, and then prorated August rent was $256, and September rent was $650, which is more than the $500. So just making sure that it's consistent with what you're actually paying. So I know these like templated forms are common and they're totally fine to use, but just making sure that it's set up in such a way where you can clearly indicate what the payments are. So, you know, if it's a security deposit, say the amount. If it's rent, you know, and it doesn't have to say maybe like, and it's maybe better to not give a specific total amount, because you could say, you know, we'll pay rent, you know, up to, you know, the unit's monthly rent for as long as the client is eligible for the program or something like that. Because when the person enters, you probably don't automatically know, you know, do they need 3 months of rent? Do they need 5 months of rent? So you could have something a little vague saying, you know, they will be paid, up to, so in this case, the rent is $650. The client, the landlord will receive a rental assistance of payment up to $650 for as long as the client's eligible for the program, something like that. And then for security deposit, making sure, again, it matches what's stated in the lease. And then if you are paying a landlord incentive, it should be stated in the agreement somewhere. Any questions on that? Okay, yeah, so this agreement should cover everything that the agency is providing to the landlord. And then it needs to be signed by both the agency and the landlord. Okay, so next is rent reasonableness. So this is used to determine this rent reasonableness is determined by considering the reasonableness of rent in relation to other unassisted comparable units. So it takes into account various elements. And there is a HUD form, which we'll show on the next slide, that's preferred, something like that, or something similar. And then what's usually kind of done along with rent reasonableness is the fair market rent. So for this one, a utility allowance does need to be calculated unless all utilities are included in rent. But if the tenant is responsible for any of the utilities, it does need to be calculated. And then the unit rent plus the utility allowance has to be below the fair market rent for the area. As a note, this fair market rent only applies to ESG funds and funds uses ESG match, but it does not apply to HPP if you're not using it as match, and it does not apply to ESG CV funds. But the rent reasonableness does apply. And both of these certifications, if applicable, need to occur prior to any assistance being provided. If a client receives assistance at multiple units, you need to certify all units. So if they're in a program and maybe they move units halfway through, needing to make sure that the original and the new unit both have documentation in the file of these things. And then at any time, if the unit rent or the utility allowance changes, that you need to complete new certifications. So here's like the basic HUD form that's encouraged to use or something similar, but it's going to be asking for the proposed unit information and then your comparable units. You're showing that your proposed rent and the utility allowance is gives you a gross rent, and that is below the payment standard. And then you want to say that it's rent reasonable, make sure you click is, and you sign and date it. So making sure you're completing all the fields. So the thing to note too, though, about rent reasonableness is you don't have to do this new for every unit. So what I would encourage people to do is have like a set template for various unit sizes. So you can preset what these comparable units are. So you would have like a set for a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom. And then, since you guys are a single county, you're Brown County, so you could maybe just set them by bedrooms. If there are certain areas, like maybe, rents in Green Bay are different than more, rural areas, you could have separate forms for that. But you can have the preset comparable units that you would just need to review at least once a year. And then when you have a new unit, you can just put in your proposed unit information, and then it's all good to go. So this is going to show some common errors. So for this first one, you can see that the proposed unit is a 2-bedroom, but all the comparables are 1-bedrooms. So that would be an error. In this one down here, it shows that the unit rent and the utility allowance actually exceeds the payment standard. So this is not sufficient, because just the rent itself is not sufficient. If just the rent is below the standard, it has to be the rent and the utility allowance to be below it. And then this form, it's just, it's missing a bunch of stuff. So this is just too blank. This is a good example where, so in this situation, they had the preset units, and then they just put in the proposed unit. And then they have down here in the payment standard, it shows it exactly, and it shows that it does not exceed the payment standard. So this is an ideal example of rent reasonableness. Any questions on that?
I was taught that when doing rent reasonableness, that like location wise, I should compare them to like, if they're in Green Bay, that I should try to compare them to the same zip code within Green Bay. Does that matter a lot? Or like, can I compare an east side to a west side? Like, I know that like Green Bay and DePere might be different, but how close or how far can they be?
So that's really dependent on the location. You know, so you're
Okay.
going to know honestly more than me, like how much the rents change. So what you don't want to
Okay.
happen is, you know, if the rents are comparable in the different areas, like then that's fine. But you don't want, you know, if your proposed unit is in, you know, maybe like a lower income area and your comparable units are all in like higher income areas,
Mhm.
you know, then it's not going to be super comparable. But as long as, you know, it's comparable location. So it doesn't have to be the same zip code. It's
Okay.
probably, you know, convenient that way, but we want to try to make it, you know, easier for you, honestly. So like, as long as it's
Okay.
similar areas, it's going to be fine. But then the other thing that reminds me, so sometimes you simply cannot find a comparable unit. So maybe, you know, it's like a really high number of bedrooms, or maybe it's like you needed an accessible unit. So that's okay. So, but when that happens, you just need to note that on the form. So I've seen some, so maybe the person needed like a 4-bedroom and they were only able to find, you know, 1 comparable unit or 2. And then that's okay, but you don't just want to leave it blank. You just want to note on the form, like, could not find other comparable units, or, you know, and maybe the unit the client needs has to be accessible and you can't find another comparable accessible unit. And so, you know, you can note that as well. So again, where it's getting to, you do what you can to find it, but like, we don't want you to have to spend hours, you know, trying to find a comparable unit. So you look for them. If you can't find it, just note on the form that you can't find it, because you're still showing, you know, that it meets the fair market. So do your best to find as comparable as possible. And that's the other thing. So like with this example, where the 2-bedroom versus the 1, maybe, you know, this 2-bedroom was more comparable to the 1-bedroom, or they couldn't find any other 2-bedrooms. Like, then just note that on the form, because if I see this just like this, that's an error. But if I see this and there's a note saying like no other 2-bedrooms were in the area, you know, then that's going to be okay, because you explained the discrepancy. Other questions? All right. So next is the minimum habitability standards. So this is also a certification that has to occur prior to any assistance being provided. Every unit must be certified. So if the person moves halfway through, make sure you have certifications for both. So this is the HUD form. There is a slightly different version that's like an older version, which is also fine, as long as it has the same, you know, standards listed. This is just, again, all from statute. Making sure you're filling it out completely. So you're marking approved for all of the standards. You're putting the, you know, the address, the participant information. You're clicking yes, that it meets the standards, and then you're signing and dating. So this form does have like an approving signature. This isn't required. This is just, you know, if your agency wants to use it. So if you have, you know, usually it's like the caseworker who's doing the evaluation, and then if you want it signed off by someone else, they can. But when I'm looking at it, I'm only looking for the evaluator. And and I know there's some agencies that do the HQS inspection in place of this, and technically that's not allowed. So for regular ESG, in almost all cases, the HQS is more restrictive, you know, like, so it's like a better inspection, but there's like one piece of it that's less. So HUD, like the HUD guidance that has come out is that, you know, any ESG funded program does have to use this specific form. I kind of go back and forth on that one, but so I will just say statute says if you're using ESG funds, you use this form. If you're using HPP, in HQS would be fine. If you're doing ESG-CV in HQS would be fine because that was a specific waiver. But if you're using ESG, you should be using this habitability form. Okay, lead-based paint. So this one, so it's only needed technically if two elements are met. So the unit was built before 1978 and a child under 6 or a pregnant woman will be in residence. And I know they mention a pregnant woman just because then that means that the intention is a young child will be in the unit. So it is preferred that you use the HUD form. But like someone said before, sometimes in the lease, they fill out this form. If they do, that's fine. But do make sure that it is filled out completely because there are sections that need to be initialed. And I do see cases where, it's the form and it's just signed at the bottom. That's technically not sufficient. It needs to be initialed at the applicable spots. And one of the things you have to initial is that you provided that pamphlet on lead poisoning prevention. So I know some people just kind of as best practice, just do this form for everybody. But when I'm looking at the form, it's only going to be like an error if the form is missing and, these conditions are met so that there's a child under 6 in the unit and the form is missing, then it's going to be a monitoring error. But yeah, here's that example where it's, you're the form and it's signed, but it's not initialed anywhere. So at the very least, it has to initial that the leasee, the tenant has received the information in the pamphlet and that the landlord is saying that like, yes, there is known or there's no knowns, no reports of lead. Okay, so those are all the elements. So I guess before I get to COVID, so are there any questions that have come up over anything I've gone over? Not for the moment, okay. So just a note on the COVID waivers. So this is where it gets complicated when you're talking about what funding cycle you're looking at. So if you're using ESG-CV funds, there are many waivers and flexibilities that apply. There are specific checklists that you can use that I've created that are specific to CV funds. However, so this is talking about funds from last year's EH cycle. So this would have been the EHH 2020 to 2021 grant cycle that ended September 30th of 21. Those funds were able to use COVID response waivers. But if you did, it has to be clearly documented in the file. So there's a few ways to do it. So this is one example someone did where they specifically had a form in the file that showed what the waivers were, and then they noted if it was utilized at any time. So this is like, I think, ideal. But you could also just have it like on the client file checklist. So for example, fair market rent does not apply if the program is in response to COVID. So you could put right on this client file checklist, like not applicable due to COVID response. Or maybe even at the top, assistance is in response to COVID. And then that alerts me when I'm looking at the file, to use those waivers. And what's extra complicated is so the waivers, so the current EHH cycle, so the 2021-2022 EHH contract is using fiscal year 21 federal funds. Those funds did not have the ability to use waivers. However, at the end of December, HUD came out and said, oh no, you can use it, but you can only use the waivers from January 1st to the end of March. So what that means, so the current contract of EHH, ESG, any client who used ESG funds from July 1st of 21, when the contract started, to the end of December, cannot use any of these COVID waivers. If the client was in the program from January through the end of March, they can use them, but anything after March, they cannot. So at the end of this month, all of these waivers go away again. So the only time in the current contract that you can use any of the COVID waivers is January to March. And that's really the fair market rent, I think there's 3 of them. I know fair market rent was waived. I think it was the prevention recertification, and another one. But so if this year you are using any of the COVID waivers or flexibilities with this year's regular ESG funds, make sure you're clear on what is eligible and how you can document it. Hopefully I didn't just confuse everybody. Any questions on that? All right. Almost done. So these are just the few important takeaways. Dates are important. You know, everything needs to be dated, then dates need to be consistent throughout the file and show a clear picture of, you know, the client's progress in the program. All items that are listed on these client file checklists are required by federal or state statutes. So they are requirements for receiving ESG funding. There's nothing that DECHR has added that is not required by statute. The forms and documentation must be readable. So I didn't really mention this, and I guess it's kind of obvious, but there are a lot of times, especially with, you know, the desk monitorings and you're scanning everything, where sometimes you'll have a form that's like, maybe the client took a picture of it and then it was scanned and then it was emailed, and like sometimes you can't even make it out. So just making sure that everything is readable and, you know, legible. Make sure forms are filled out completely. So, you know, making sure things are signed, making sure things are dated, that you're noting, you know, like, yes, it's rent reasonableness. Yes, it meets the habitability standards, like filling it out completely. If it's not documented in the file, compliance cannot be confirmed. So that's where you kind of get in the difference between in the monitoring of a concern versus a finding. So a finding is like, there's documentation of non-compliance. However, with the concern is you can't confirm it. So like if it's not documented, like most likely it did happen, but I can't confirm it did. So that's where the documentation is vital. And if you have questions at any time, please reach out and ask. That is what we're here for. I want to make sure, you know, that you have the right information. I don't want you to be doing something and being frustrated or think you're doing it wrong. I would much rather you just reach out, ask your question, get clarification, and you're good to go going forward. And here's my contact information in case you don't have it. So that's the full PowerPoint, but I want to go back. Are there any other questions you guys have? Anything that you could use some more clarification on? No? Okay, hopefully that means this training was very helpful and cleared up some things. And I will be sending a copy of the PowerPoint to Beth after this meeting. And then you're welcome to send it out to whoever would like it.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think I have any questions right away. Just, I think I may have missed a little bit. I apologize. It's sometimes really difficult to do trainings when we're in shelter.
Oh, sure. Totally get it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to make sure that, well, no, I guess I don't really have any questions. So, but Sarah, you said you'd check into the EHH funding for
yes,
licensed facilities. So,
yes, I will get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, well, I guess if that's all, then we'll end the training here. So thank you everyone for attending, and please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
All right.
Bye.